Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about some scientific shenanigans, but not from creationists. So, let's jump right in. Everything in the universe is affected by laws of physics and chemistry, and organisms are no different. Certainly, these laws constrain our development in different ways. For instance, every biology high school, if not earlier, student is introduced to the concept of cell size constraints. That is, cells must stay within a particular set of surface area to volume ratios, or else they'd be unable to effectively function. And in our videos, Abiogenesis Part 2, and Creationist Statistics, we've seen how physics, geochemistry, and biochemistry interacted to produce the first living cells. So no one can deny the importance of physics and chemistry in biology. However, proponents of an idea called biological structuralism, which we'll just call structuralism here, believe that these forces are more important in the generation of body plans than forces such as natural selection and genetic drift. This is a rather curious notion, as we mention both of these processes fairly regularly on this channel, and the technical literature is replete with real-world examples of these. Structuralists would argue that developmental constraints, as well as the self-organizational properties of molecules and tissues, are, by and large, responsible for morphology, that the body plans of organisms are products of the underlying physics. In Stephen Jay Gould's book, Wonderful Life, he makes an analogy that says if you rewound the tape of life, organisms would come out looking very different. Structuralists, however, would say that if you rewound the tape, life would come out looking pretty much the same. But is this the case? Very unlikely. Theist Inspiring Philosophy presents the structuralist viewpoint in his video Was Life Inevitable, and that's in the description. Even though we are using a theist as the main example for this video, structuralism isn't exclusively based on a theistic belief system. There were many who proposed their own unique cases for structuralism based on entirely natural principles. Furthermore, structuralist thinking also frequently pops up as an unconscious bias towards anthropocentrism, specifically when it comes to speculations about other intelligent life forms. We often think that for something else to be intelligent like us, it has to be like us in almost every other aspect, implying that the human form is the optimal form for intelligent life. This is exemplified by the so-called dinosauroid, which was conceived by Dale Russell when he speculated that troodontids could have evolved into creatures with human-level intelligence if the KT impactor hadn't wiped them all out. Structuralist thinking, as well as probably lack of imagination, is also one of the reasons why most intelligent alien species in sci-fi movie culture are all humanoid. Although, aside from the fact that it is impractical to turn your actors into creatures with an entirely different body plan, aliens are often human-like because that will make it easier for the audience to sympathize with and read the emotions of these characters. It would also make potential romantic relationships between them and humans less awkward. However, since the features of the human form are the results of incremental modifications that were compiled over many millions of years of evolution, it's unlikely that another life form would follow the exact same evolutionary route. It's also unlikely that a theropod would evolve the same erect posture that humans have for bipedality, considering that theropods were already walking well on two legs to begin with. As Darren Naish pointed out, a highly intelligent troodontid would likely retain most of the basic theropod body plan, with a horizontal posture and long tail, and would probably manipulate objects with the snout and feet in the manner of a bird, rather than with human-like hands. Now on to IP's video. Go watch that before continuing. Back? Good. IP's main lines of evidence for structuralism are that molecules self-organize and that physical forces were largely responsible for the origin of life. Convergent evolution is rampant throughout organisms, though he focuses largely on animals. And intelligent organisms exist, implying the existence of a Platonic universe of ideal forms. The first two are pretty straightforward. Molecules do self-organize and interact with each other governed by physical laws, and convergent evolution really does happen quite a lot. When organisms enter similar environments, they tend to converge on similar forms. For example, prehensile tails have evolved repeatedly in mammals, such as in platyrrhines, opossums, and New World porcupines. Now, did they evolve these features because their environment is similar? Sure. Prehensile tails have adaptive value in an arboreal environment. When you live in a tree, it's helpful to have grasping appendages for keeping yourself from tumbling to the forest floor. This very same argument can be made for every example of convergence that IP shows. The convergent traits have adaptive value in their particular environments. Thus, his numerous examples don't favor his structuralist interpretation at all. That his convergent structures, like the wings of birds, butterflies, pterosaurs, and bats, are built in different ways from different structural elements is an argument for functionalism, meaning that these structures were shaped by mutations and selection, not structuralism. The modern evolutionary synthesis has no problem explaining adaptations, and this is why structuralists like intelligent designer Michael Denton use structuralism not to explain adaptations, but body plans. In fact, let's let Denton himself explain structuralism.
In other words, on other planets, the same laws of form, the same laws of nature will generate the same forms of life we see on Earth. So it's the idea, it goes back to Aristotle's forms, that the biological world consists at its base of a series of what Owen called primal patterns, or basic forms generated by laws of form in nature. So that's structuralism. It doesn't say that all the order, it's not explaining all the order of the biological world. It doesn't explain adaptation. It's an attempt to explain the bioplans, the basic plans, why we have insects, why we have vertebrates and things like this. The basic underlying patterns which underlie the basic taxa in the world.
In general, each phylum is recognized as such because of a distinctive body plan. Even when members of a phylum seem to have fairly different morphologies, they are still modifications on the same body plan. For instance, millipedes and spiders are both arthropods but look quite a bit different. Or take our chordate phylum, with forms as disparate as lampreys and kangaroos, as well as us. Structuralists would look at these and say that they are both products of the arthropod or chordate forms. But that's overlooking far too much variation to be meaningful. And when you investigate arthropod or chordate genetics, you realize that they both end up looking as they do because they have a set of modified Hox genes regulating their ontogeny. The placement of legs, the abdomen, and head, among other things, are the products of Hox genes. Homologs of those arthropod Hox genes are present in onychophorans and tardigrades, often having similar functions. Fascinatingly, homologs of specific Hox genes exist in both arthropods and vertebrates like ourselves, such as PAX6. The last common ancestor of arthropods and vertebrates lived in the late Precambrian. This means that the picture IP shows of all the different eyes, all of which come from bilaterally symmetrical animals, is full of animals with eyes controlled by homologs of the same PAX6 gene family. The eyes shown were therefore not evolved in response to sunlight, but are simply variations on the same gene family that existed in all of them. Pushing back in time, the ancestral eye didn't evolve in response to seeing sunlight either. As we mentioned in the video Evolution of the Eye, Euglena has an eye spot too. However, its eye spot is only good enough to indicate in which direction light exists. Euglena contains chloroplasts, which perform photosynthesis, as well as a flagellum, so having an organelle that points it in the direction of sunlight is going to provide a selective advantage. Only later on would there be animals for which having a sight organ was helpful in differentiating predators from prey. But since evolution has no foresight and genetic variations are random, natural selection and the other mechanisms could only work on what was available. That's why roses, oak trees, algae, and cyanobacteria don't have eyes despite using photosynthesis also. Well, that's one down. What about wings? Did wings evolve in response to wind? No, definitely not. If wings evolved in response to wind, then why don't all terrestrial animals have wings? This claim is nonsense. Particular animals have wings because they lived in environments where having wings was selectively advantageous and happened to have had relevant mutations that opened up new adaptive options for their descendants. The first arthropods were aquatic and so didn't have wings, and even the early terrestrial arthropods, such as myriapods, didn't have wings. Eventually, the class Insecta evolved wings and became very successful, probably as a result. The sheer number of species of insects testifies to the selective advantages of their morphology. Insects, birds, pterosaurs, and bats all probably evolved their wings in a similar manner. They were originally used for gliding, but became progressively useful in flight. Dinosaurs, as we saw in the videos Theropoda and Avialae, used their feathers first for display, and they were later accepted for flight. The record of early pterosaurs and bats is pretty spotty, but they both probably started like modern colugos, using their side flaps of skin for gliding. Regardless, wings provide selective advantages both in being able to escape predators or being able to catch prey. And what about that last one? Did brains evolve in response to the ideal forms that exist as part of the universe? No again. Enlargement of the human brain was the result of a number of factors. One hypothesis proposes that the pseudogenization of the sarcomeric myosin gene MYH16 reduced jaw muscles, thus lessening the constraints on brain size. Later mutations in glucose transporters shifted the distribution of energy allocation from skeletal muscle to brain tissues, documented in the 2011 paper, A Potential Role for Glucose Transporters in the Evolution of Human Brain Size. Another paper, the 2003 Metabolic Correlates of Hominid Brain Evolution, posits that metabolic energy became distributed in hominins more to fat reserves as energy for the brain due to how expensive the tissue is to maintain than to muscles. So, researchers attributed the size of the brain to a few mutations that reduced musculature and others that redistributed metabolic energy throughout the body. And of course, having a large brain has selective advantages. Being able to make tools or hunting strategies to capture prey while avoiding being eaten by larger predators is quite useful. Needless to say, no anthropologists are attributing the size of the brain as a response to Platonic forms sewn into the fabric of the universe. Where does IP's quote claiming this come from, you ask? Not an evolutionary biologist or an anthropologist, but Catholic theologian and fierce proponent of intelligent design, Edward T. Oakes. Why a theologian instead of a biologist? Reasons, I guess. And what about that Daniel Dennett quote? Dennett is an atheist evolutionist after all, and so his quote relating Darwinian evolution to Platonism is the clincher for their synthesis, right? No, not at all. For reference, Plato's idea of reincarnation and reminiscence is that people are born already with knowledge in their souls of the universal forms. Darwin, on the other hand, likely didn't believe in a soul, and so any innate concepts or instincts we have are the result of evolutionary forces. That is, having certain instincts helped organisms better survive in an environment. While they both share the superficial resemblance of having some form of innate knowledge, there is no hint of Platonism in the Darwinian explanation. Finally, can some macroscopic things be explained in terms similar to structuralism? Yes, Gould's idea of spandrels is one such case. For example, the human chin is thought to have no selective advantage. It exists solely due to the shape of our skull and how muscles and skin lay across it. So no one is denying that some structures exist as a result of the physical layout of our bodies. Where your brain or stomach or heart goes isn't the result of physical forces predominantly, but genes like the ones mentioned earlier. In fact, I happen to know someone whose research involves genes and how those affect our development. So, I'm going to hand things over to evolutionary developmental biologist P.Z. Myers. Take it away.
Hey, Jackson's friends. Jackson has already dismantled the arguments from excessive structuralism. I really have nothing to add to that right now. Instead, I'd like to give you a little historical context for structuralism so that you're not totally put off on it. As a developmental biologist, I have a lot of sympathy for structuralism, and I think it still has some relevance that ought not to be dismissed. So don't take the excesses of some people as reason to disagree with it. Okay, the pinnacle of structuralist thought was the work of Darcy Wentworth Thompson, author of that masterpiece on growth and form. This was a brilliant work, and I don't say that lightly, but it's also a peculiar work. It was written during World War I at a time when Mendel's genetics had been rediscovered, but there was still a lot of conflict and misunderstandings of genetics. Thompson lived through a period of transition, moving from a time lacking any good scientific understanding of inheritance — Darwin's ideas don't count there — to one where genetics had a strong experimental foundation. And Thompson's dismay with genetics shows. He doesn't discuss genes at all. Instead, he describes growth and development in terms of responses to forces, internal and external. In many ways, On Growth and Form can be read as a reaction against the unrushing genetic hegemony that dominated the thinking of the 20th century. Developmental biologists love the book in general, but we have kind of a mixed reaction to its message. The importance of DNA and genetics is undeniable, yet at the same time, Thomson is pointing to processes that are often neglected in biology. In some ways, the molecular biology revolution has been too successful, leading to an abandonment of essential principles that Thomson discussed. But at the same time, Thomson goes way too far and isn't relevant to key mechanisms in development anymore. Sad to say. If I had to name one person who best represented the bridge between structuralism and modern molecular biology, I would surprise you a little bit and say Alan Turing. Little known fact, Turing was quite an important figure in theoretical developmental biology. He was interested in how simple chemical reactions could produce complex, repetitive morphological patterns, and came up with a model of reaction diffusion. It was an elegant scheme describing how the chemical properties of just a few molecules could produce, for instance, alternating stripes. And that fits right in with structuralism. But he's probably better known for his ideas about computing. He postulated that one could build a universal computing engine that would be capable of flexibly solving a large number of problems. That building around a coded sequence would allow the generation of a multitude of algorithms and solutions. What that meant in the evolution of life is that once an encoding mechanism evolved, life could be much more fluid and finessed. Now, instead of having one chemical law-based pattern generator, you could have a multitude of processes all precisely tuned to generate even more complex patterns. This led to some interesting interpretations, and biology swayed way too far to the other side. Ernst Mayr, for instance, and many other biologists even predicted that there would be little to no homology at the genetic level, that selection was a universal acid, to use Dennett's later phrase, and different phyla would retain no similarities at the genetic level. That was shown to be wrong in the 80s with the work of comparative molecular biologists and the new science of evo-devo. We found homologies at the gene level all over the place. It turns out selection wasn't as corrosive as expected, and evolution was building an impressive amount of diversity on top of historically conserved genetic frameworks. Structuralism is rising up again, but more as a partner process to natural selection. They work together, or sometimes against each other. So, for instance, Gunther Wagner, in his book Homology, Genes, and Evolutionary Innovation, sets this up as a dichotomy, which even compares to the nature-nurture debate. So Wagner says, for instance, let me read a little bit of this. Throughout the history of evolutionary biology, as well as many other sciences, there has been a conflict between two styles of thinking. One is conventionally called functionalism, although in evolutionary biology the term adaptation is more frequently used today because a trait's functional fit for its office is produced through adaptation by natural selection. That is, function is explained by adaptation through natural selection. The functionalist stance is one that explains organismal traits through their functional and adaptive values. The alternative style of thinking does not have a generic name in biology, although in other areas of study it is called structuralism. In evolutionary biology, the most influential structuralist manifesto is The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm by Gould and Lewontin. In their essay, Gould and Lewontin attack the adaptationist assumption that each feature of an organism had to have an adaptive explanation. The spandrels of the Basilica di San Marco were not built to accept an angel picture, rather they were a geometric consequence of structure that was built with arches. Like the nature-nurture debate, though, the only reasonable reconciliation between the two is through synthesis. Both are important, both matter, both provide a combinatorial interaction that leads to an explanation of diversity by building on a framework of historical utility. What this means for structuralism is that there is more than one way to build a patterned organism. There are millions of ways, and chance and history play a role in dictating what patterns will form. To expect life will take a particular pathway when there's only a few possibilities is one thing. But when there are nearly infinite combinatorial ways to build a body from scratch, it becomes highly unlikely. It is curious that the structuralist extremists like Simon Conway Morris, or the fellow behind Inspiring Philosophy, like to think that evolution leads inevitably to human-like forms, ignoring the obvious fact that it leads instead to endless forms most beautiful. As someone who actually favors many structuralist ideas, as does Gunther Wagner, if you want a more authoritative source, this contradicts the evidence. Okay, back to you, Jackson.
Thanks, PZ. A link to his channel is in the description. To summarize, physical forces do indeed play a role in our development and our evolution. However, our evolutionary history is guided both by physical forces and, importantly, genetics. There's no reason to think that if we rewound the tape of life, we'd get similar organisms, or that if we visited an alien planet, we'd find humanoids like ourselves. At its base, our genes and our morphology are heavily contingent on what mutations occurred and when. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.